It's been a hell of a party. The last 10 years, a decade of decadence, with easy credit giving us a bling lifestyle. The trappings of the Celtic tiger, gift-wrapped by a bloated property market that pumped up our economy to bursting point.
It was a bubble, you know, it was euphoric. The government were cheerleading it.
Caught up with the fear of being left behind, missing the boat, not getting on the property ladder.
That Irish banks behaved very irresponsibly in their mortgage lending practices. This is how banks operate. When they make loans, they give themselves bonuses. Banks sell loans just like car dealers sell cars. And these people made huge loans and they made huge bonuses as a consequence.
Money, profits, you'd be surprised the results that it can get on any facet of anything. You have enough money, you can smuggle people into countries, you can bring drugs or guns or bombs or whatever you want once you oil enough cogs with money. And property is no different. Enough people get paid the right amounts, things happen, and maybe a development went up that was an eyesore. Maybe people complained and said we don't think that should be.
The players capable of putting a stop to this madness stayed out of the game. Lack of regulation by the central bank and the financial regulator pumped up the bubble. Despite having the powers to put the brakes on and implement stricter regulations on the banks, our key regulatory institutions let this overinflated property market freewheel into a crash.
It's not really the role of the central bank to say tut-tut every now and again. You know, the role of the central bank, including the financial regulator, is to remove the punch bowl. And that didn't happen here. It didn't happen in a lot of other countries too.
Well, at all stages, the regulator maintains that he was supervising these institutions correctly and that proper lending practices were observed by the relevant financial institutions. Naturally, in the light of the information we now possess, the whole system of regulation worldwide has to be reviewed. What's happened in Ireland is not unique to Ireland. But I do want to say this, in relation to personal lending, it is clear that Ireland was not exposed to 100% lending to anything like the same extent as many other countries. Now, I think you've raised an issue about multiples of salaries and whether the correct multiples of salaries were followed. Again, the regulator maintains that correct practices were observed in that regard.
It certainly has been the case that the central bank and the financial regulator have not behaved well in the lead up to this. It's been evident for a very long time that Irish banks were lending recklessly. And the attitude of the regulators was, as long as the markets are happy with these banks, there can be no conceivable problem.
But who were we to believe when the developers, the estate agents, the bankers and their economists kept reassuring us not to worry?
I can understand the situation at the moment, that people feel very sore and sentiment is very sour. There is also an understandable Irish and maybe international trend. Let's find someone to blame for all that. And would that it were that simple, that there was someone to blame. Yes, my economic forecasts envisaged a much softer property landing. And most economists envisaged the economies not only of Ireland, but of the entire globe, faring much better over the last while.
The government also did nothing to stop this bubble from expanding to bursting point. The Galway tent politics of doing business with developers and bankers meant they paid little heed to those warning it would all end in tears.
The central bank knew that banks like Bank of Ireland were offering in 2005 new 100% mortgage products. Banks effectively, through unsecured lending as well for fixtures and fittings and furniture, and knowing that people were purchasing at high multiples, knowing they were getting parental assistance, knowing that they were taking out credit union loans for the deposit, for these 8% or whatever, effectively the central bank knew that people were buying properties they couldn't afford.
The market in housing and property is a free market.
To stop the growth of that market, the government couldn't control the money supply because that's controlled nowadays from the European Central Bank at Frankfurt. We don't control our own money supply. So the weapon of using interest rates, which is the traditional weapon to control a housing boom, you increase the interest rates. Our government doesn't have that power.
By the time our construction boom was exploding, we were heading for the perfect storm. The international financial crisis dovetailed with Ireland's property collapse. Our overexposure to a bloated construction industry now meant we were in deep trouble.
I would hold my hand up and say that I expected things to be much softer in terms of the landing. It certainly wasn't because I was an economist in a bank. It was because my view was that policymakers would respond differently and behave differently, and that the underlying situation in the economy would be stronger.
What has been bad in the last few months, they've badly mishandled the situation. They seem to think that this is just a passing blip, that in a few months' time it'll all be behind us. You have to remember, this is not the end of Ireland's economic difficulties, or even the beginning of the end. A house in one of the better parts of Dublin that was selling for 800,000 or 900,000 a while ago is probably worth somewhere around 220,000, 250,000 tops. When house prices start to collapse, they very often, not only do they rise too much, but they often end up falling too much. So houses actually end up going from being very bad value to being very good value. And I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised if houses, say, which were selling for 800,000 or 900,000 end up under 200,000. I think that...
Sometimes they talk about an addiction to debt, and if you were to use that analogy, if you look at it like, say, a drug addict, and they're hurting, you know, they got to get some drugs. They want to shoot up. If you give them the drug, they're going to feel better. And they'll thank you for it. Say, yeah, you sorted me out, cheers. But you're not fixing that problem. And until we reach a point where people say, like, we're willing to take the necessary steps and not put unwanted mortgages on the generation of tomorrow to benefit the generation of today, we have learned nothing.
I think the lesson we have to learn as a nation and as a people is that it's by our exports and by the visitors we attract to Ireland that our economy thrives.
David McWilliams, or really a know-it-all Southside man, was born and raised in leafy South Dublin. A direct descendant of Nostradamus, Southside man predicted the Great Recession of 2008, the resurgence of snuff, and even Twink's menopause.
In 2008, the shit finally hit the fan. The bottomless well had run dry. The sick little tiger finally lay down to die. Night of the negative equity. From the makers of Nightmare on Wall Street, the Texas subprime massacre, and 28 loans later, comes a tale so horrifying you'll wish you were already dead already.
Here's Eddie.
Night of the negative equity. Jesus Christ!